All right, so Andrew Yang has been going through it recently, still going around trying to promote his Forward Party, where it's still very much up in the air exactly what they really even stand for, outside of just basically being milquetoast centrism and vague platitudes about what they may or may not stand for. So I wanted to get into this interview that Andrew Yang did with Jim Acosta of CNN, where he basically somehow got rolled by this very standard corporate journalist here when he was just asking some of the most basic possible questions you could ask of a political party. So let's go ahead and jump into this, and I will commentate my way through it.
And let me ask you about your new Forward Party, because you say it's an attempt to appeal to what you say is the moderate common sense majority. It's also the same name as your book. Is this an attempt to pump up book sales?
Okay, so I'm going to pause it there because he mentions this a couple of different times throughout the interview, but I think that that's just a really kind of bad faith question because, I think you could point to, a reason to believe why this party is not going to be a legitimate third party pushback against our two-party corrupt duopoly, and plenty of fair criticisms that we're going to get into here. But the idea that Yang solely started this political party for book sales is kind of just fucking ridiculous and a dumb question to ask. But even on top of that, I think that the premise of the question says a lot because he was framing that question as the Forward Party wants to be this sort of centrist, common sense majority party, which is pretty much exactly what Democrats have been calling themselves since the Bill Clinton era. So, I mean, the idea that the Forward Party being this centrist coalition, as if that's going to provide any alternative really in a true underlying sense to the problems of having two political parties, Democrats and Republicans, that are both owned by the same corporate interests. You're really not providing anything new there or anything really of substance at all. You're basically just trying to be like Kirsten Sinema or Joe Manchin embodied in a political party, but they continue here.
Well, I'd have to say this would be a pretty silly way to go about it, given that we have co-founded a national party that now has tens of thousands of Americans signed up, co-chaired by former governor of New Jersey, Christine Todd Whitman. And the fact is 62% of Americans
But are you
want
just
a
promoting
third party.
yourself, I guess is what I'm asking is, are you just out there promoting yourself with this?
Again, Jim, there are, as you can easily imagine, there are hundreds of better ways to go about promoting a book than starting a political party to do so. I mean, I'm building this party because 62% of Americans want it. We're more polarized than ever. And
okay, but 62% of Americans want, in theory, a third political party. That doesn't necessarily mean that all of that 62% wants your specific political party. I mean, I know tons of leftists that want to see a viable third party from the left flank of the Democratic Party, but that's not what you're doing. You're also not providing a third party for the, deranged Republicans who want to break away from the establishment Republicans. So the idea that that 62% number means that 62% of the country is willing to support the Forward Party, that's just completely disingenuous. But in just a theoretical, hypothetical sense, yes, 100% the overwhelming majority of the country wants to see, some breakaway from the two-party system here.
And the fact is the two parties have divvied up the country so that 79 to 90% of races are uncompetitive. Most of the people watching this right now aren't even living under a two-party system. They're living under one party.
He's 100% right about that point, and there's a number of different angles, I guess, that you could, make that analysis. Number one is the one that he's going with, basically, pointing out gerrymandering at the state and federal levels, and how, if you happen to be a Democrat or a Republican living in a disproportionately Democrat or Republican area, your vote doesn't really count. If you're a Democrat who lives in Wyoming and you're voting for, Liz Cheney or something like that, you really don't have a left-wing or Democratic even opposition available to you. So that's a good point to be making, I guess. And if I was going to give him or the Forward Party just a little bit of credit on some of the very few policy positions they've openly come out in favor of, being against gerrymandering and being in favor of ranked choice voting are some that I would 100% agree with that could help us get to a viable third party. But on top of that, I would add another layer of analysis, which is kind of important, which Andrew Yang wouldn't agree with, but that's that, you not only have in some of these gerrymandered districts only one party that you're voting voting for, but you really only have a one-party system here because Democrats and Republicans both represent the same exact corporate interests within corporate America and the military-industrial complex that fund their campaigns. And that's the core problem here, right? The problem with American politics or our political system isn't just that we have two parties and that's the only options that we have. It's that we have two parties who are both significantly to the right of the American people, who both accept those corporate bribes from corporate America and the military-industrial complex. That's the actual underlying problem. And so he's going to ask a question later in this interview about where exactly the funding is going to be coming for forward party candidates. And again, if you're going to be accepting corporate donations, then you're not really providing a third party alternative. You're just providing like a third party label that, other corporate Democrats and corporate Republicans can get behind. So, again, a couple different angles of analysis that you could run with there.
The other week, I asked veteran Democratic strategist James Carville about what he thought of the Forward Party, and he had quite a strong reaction. Let's listen to that.
I think in a nation awash in really stupid ideas, this stands out as a really stupid idea. Ralph Nader basically elected George W. Bush in 2000. Jill Stein basically elected Donald Trump in 2016. And the only possible thing this could do is bleed some moderate Republicans off of voting for whoever the Democratic nominee is. This thing is going nowhere. It's vanity. Look at me. It's performance art.
Okay, so a couple of different things to say about that. Number one, this guy, James Carville, which kind of ties into the point that I was making before. He was like one of the biggest proponents of like third way politics under the Clinton administration and, pushing the Democratic Party to more represent like independents or Republicans and pushing them significantly to the right. So, James Carville does kind of represent the same lane that Andrew Yang's Forward Party is also trying to occupy. So not surprising that this type of absolute ghoul would come out against it, but not exactly a trustworthy source on like what stupid ideas are, because if you go back and look at what he was saying during the 2020 Democratic primary about like Bernie Sanders or even like Elizabeth Warren, this guy thinks that like Medicare for all is a stupid idea. He thinks that like free community college is a stupid idea, and you could run down the list of every single major good left-wing policy that could materially improve people's lives. This guy's going to be against it because he is a corporate Democrat through and through. So not exactly somebody's opinion that I would trust, but on top of that, you also have the underlying point that Jim Acosta is trying to hammer home throughout this interview, basically trying to say that even the hypothetical potential of a third party in our political system is always inherently going to be a spoiler effect, which is kind of bullshit because, again, I 100% in theory support the idea of a third party. I would want there to be a third party that actually represents a broad working class coalition of the American people, but that's not what this party is. And so I'm in theory for a third political party, but if it's going to be what the Forward Party seems to be, then it absolutely would not be worth it. But pushing this narrative that every third party is just always going to be a spoiler is an incredibly weak argument from Jim Acosta here.
What's your response to that, Andrew? Is this, hey, look at me?
Well, even his description jumps straight to the presidential race, which is not where our focus is at all. Our focus is on the 506,000 locally elected officials, school board members, city council members, mayors, county executives, because again, in the majority of the country, 70% of these races are uncompetitive or uncontested. The American people want real choice. We want to provide
but people obviously
to them
worry.
in their towns and communities and where
those
they live.
lower level races are obviously important, but people worry about another 2016 scenario where a third party candidate like Jill Stein or Gary Johnson costs Hillary Clinton the election.
Okay, notice how he just swept in Gary Johnson alongside Jill Stein as if both of them combined somehow cost Hillary Clinton the election. Gary Johnson was a right-wing libertarian candidate, so I would think that if anything, he was more drawing from the Donald Trump or the Republican votes than Hillary Clinton. But even on top of that, we've seen all of the data that's come out. The idea that Jill Stein single-handedly cost Hillary Clinton the election is 100% bullshit. You should always blame the politicians Republicans for whatever election they happen to lose, if you are not able to represent the people who voted for Jill Stein's, their policy beliefs or what they wanted to see out of a leader better than Jill Stein, then you're just fucked. I mean, go win their votes. Go represent a better political agenda that excites the base that you're trying to get to vote for you. I mean, you can't just sit back and expect people to vote for you and like try to guilt trip them and say, oh, vote blue no matter who, as we've heard just repeatedly throughout basically the last couple of years especially. But again, the idea that like political candidates are not responsible for earning the votes of their constituencies is, again, an incredibly weak point here from Jim Acosta.
Don't you think that putting yourself out there, putting this party out there as an alternative that appeals to some moderate Republicans, could potentially throw the race to Donald Trump, put Donald Trump back in the White House? Is that what you want?
I'm the co-chair of an anti-extremist party. I ran against Trump. So I don't plan on doing anything that's going to increase Trump's odds. But again, 62% of Americans want a third party. And we are looking right now at a competitive U.S. Senate race as one example, where you have an independent, Evan McMullin, running neck and neck with a Trump-endorsed incumbent in an environment
but the Democratic
that,
Party
frankly,
in Utah,
the
Democratic Party out in Utah got behind Evan McMullin. Andrew, why not run?
Okay, so in that instance, he's trying to like latch the Forward Party into this like vague connection that they have with this candidate out in Utah. But that guy is like a perfect example of why I don't like the Forward Party, because he's just a standard conservative who just happens to be anti-Trump. So if you're, running with this narrative of like not left, not right, but forward, it's like, what the fuck does that mean? If you're, coming out, and I saw the other day he endorsed like Liz Cheney, he's coming out and endorsing this like standard conservative, more of like a Bush era conservative against an anti-Trump candidate. It's like you have no actual underpinning ideological framework here. You're just running with whoever wants to join our vague centrist label or our anti-Trump and anti-leftist coalition label here. So it's just, they don't really stand for anything. And on top of that, you also have the fact that this party was formed with a coalition of former basically Bush era Republicans and a whole bunch of corporate Democrats. So again, you're kind of just taking like some of the worst aspects of both parties and combining them into one political party, while I guess pushing off the fringes of the radical pro-Trump Republican right, while also trying to alienate what he would call the radical left, which I guess really just means like AOC and Ilhan Omar and Bernie Sanders and people who are pushing for overwhelmingly popular policies. So there's like a massive false equivalence that he's putting forward here with the extremes on both sides, but he's going to touch more on that here in a second.
Again as a Democrat. If you want to be president, run again as a Democrat.
So Jim, I haven't made any conclusions about 2024 except for the fact that the United States needs a unifying positive third party movement because we're getting increasingly polarized. And if it's not Trump, it's going to be a successor to Trump, because this system is uniquely vulnerable to authoritarianism. You have a two-party system.
But I can hear the folks over at the White House. President Biden has had Republican.
We just need a better system.
But President Biden, I can hear Democrats over at the White House saying President Biden has had Republican support on a number of agenda items. He is trying to work in a bipartisan fashion. Why not try to support that as a Democrat? You were just a Democrat 10 minutes ago.
I support attempts to cross the aisle, but we can all see that 7 out of 10 of the Republicans that bravely voted to impeach Trump are already going to be out of Congress by the time January comes along, and the moderate population in both parties is unfortunately dwindling quickly. So the political incentive.
Okay, so again, a couple of different things there. Number one, he says that the common sense majority or the center of both political parties is dwindling. What exactly do you mean by that? Because I could get that in the sense of the Republican Party, where an overwhelming majority of them just voted against contraception, voted against codifying Roe v. Wade, voted against gay marriage. So like tons of different things where I could point to how the Republican Party has moved significantly to the right, especially on cultural issues. They've always been massively to the right on economics and militarism, etc., but shifted significantly to the right on cultural issues. But what is the equivalent to that within the Democratic Party? As if like people who are calling for universal health care and tackling climate change and free community college, that like those are on equal footing in being out of step with the so-called center of both political parties. It's like, no. And this kind of cuts through to one of my main points that I always come back to, is like there's a huge difference between what it means to have bipartisanship among the American people versus what it means to be working in a bipartisan bipartisan way within the corrupt DC swamp. And you can see that perfectly with Biden's agenda. And, Jim Acosta's coming out here bragging about him working with Republicans. Well, first of all, on all of his major flagship proposals that Biden has been pushing forward, Republicans have basically been calling him a demon communist throughout the entirety of that and throwing up double middle fingers to him throughout that whole process. But on the very few pieces of legislation, like the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the bipartisan gun legislation, etc., all of those were just watered down into oblivion. So it's like a perfect example of how, especially on the gun control bill, it's like, okay, congrats, you got a bipartisan, gun control measure put in place, but it also didn't have like a bunch of the most popular and important gun control measures that the overwhelming majority of the country supports. Things like universal background checks. So like the idea that like bipartisanship is always a good thing is complete and utter bullshit, let alone mentioning how Biden has been getting basically completely rolled by not only Republicans, but also corporate Democrats, essentially Republicans like Manchin and Sinema within his own party.
End up disproportionately empowering the 10% of extremes on both sides.
But you're going to have to come up with policy
really
positions.
Negative results.
Right,
so
but
we
Andrew,
just need a better system.
Yeah, but Andrew, you're going to have policy positions at some point. How does the Forward Party feel about Roe versus Wade? Should it have been overturned?
Well, I personally think that women's reproductive rights are fundamental human rights. But the Forward Party has not left or right, but forward stance on even the most divisive and contentious issues.
Well, what does that
there's
mean? Don't you have to take a position on something? Don't you have to take a position on something? You can't just say, well, this is a hot button issue, so I'm not going to take a position on you. If you want to run the country, you're going to have to make some hard decisions, Andrew.
Again, the Forward Party is about that common sense consensus majority view, which is very clear on abortion. It's clear.
What about guns? What about assault weapons?
On climate change. It's actually clear on just about every issue under the sun.
If it's that clear, then why can you not just come out and say it? He just asked you a very direct question. Does the Forward Party support the overturning of Roe v. Wade, or do you stand against that? And he's not giving an actual take here. He's just saying, well, my personal opinion is that, Roe v. Wade or abortion should be considered a fundamental human rights. Okay, that's great. That's your personal opinion, but does the Forward Party actually have a position on that? Or are you just going to be welcoming people within your party, half of which are actually representing the overwhelming majority opinion, which is that Roe v. Wade should not have been overturned? Are you just going to have people in your party that support that, and then also have people in your party that are anti-choice, have people in your party that think that abortion should be criminalized? You have to have some sort of a standard, and if your standard is a broad, common sense majority opinion, then just come out and fucking say that. Say, yes, the Forward Party is only going to have candidates who represent that broad majority opinion that Roe v. Wade should not have been overturned. It's not that difficult to respond with actual clarity in an instance like that, or on gun control, right? Do you support an assault weapons ban? Do you support any number of other policies that are actually on the table that are supported by broad majority of the American people? It's not that difficult of a fucking question to ask, but he has to, draw back to his own personal opinion and not have an actual take from the Forward Party outlined with, clarification, because they don't actually have any standards. They're just going to be welcoming in, whichever people want to identify under their label, and, policy positions or ideological framework just doesn't fucking matter at all to them.
18-year-olds be able to buy AR-15s?
Because of the nature of our system.
Should 18-year-olds be able to buy AR-15s?
Again, the common sense consensus majority is that there should be some rules around background checks and access to firearms, but we're not getting any of these things, Jim, because the two-party system does not need to deliver.
But it doesn't sound like you're taking any hard positions. It sounds like you're
trade power.
It sounds like you're sort of a fill-in-the-blank party. If somebody wants a party with no clear policy positions, you're it. But unfortunately, in the real world, you have to take a position on something.
Well, we're for the common sense consensus view on guns, abortion, climate change, but we're not getting a common sense.
He's basically just saying we are for good things and against bad things. That's literally all that he's saying here.
What are those positions?
Any of those things, Jim? And
those
Americans
are just sort of fuzzy, but those are fuzzy, nebulous. It sounds like you came up with something in a focus group. Common sense, middle of the ground. That sounds wonderful. That sounds great. But at the end of the day, don't you have to take a position on something?
Well, the great thing is the American people know where we want the country to go. And what we know that we need a more dynamic, truly representative system than we're getting right now, which is why the Forward Party is growing so quickly. Tens of thousands of Americans have signed up in all 50 states because we know that the two-party system is getting worse, not better, and we know we need something new.
And who is going to be bankrolling the Forward Party? Will you pledge to be very upfront and candid and transparent about where your money comes from?
Yeah, it's transparent for all to see. And the people that are bankrolling us are everyday Americans who are sending $10, $20, $30 because there's such an enormous appetite for change. And one of the things I tell people...
Any corporate money coming in? Outside money? Foreign money?
It's completely transparent for all to see. But I can say that our money has not been coming in from corporations. It's been coming in from everyday Americans who want something better for us and our families.
You'll pledge to put that on a website, or if a news organization comes to you and says, we'd like to see this information, will you pledge to make that information available?
Well, Jim, I'm going to actually tell you, we don't have a choice. Like, we have to file every 3 months, so anyone who wants to see it can just check it out.
Okay, so, I mean, just a completely weaselly fucking answer there. I mean, the question was pretty clear. He was asking, like, do you take a principled stance against corporate PAC donations or money from corporate America in general? And Andrew Yang's response to that is to say, well, I mean, basically, so far, we've been getting a lot of small dollar donations, even though, again, they haven't really been running any major candidates that would put this theory to a test of whether or not they would support candidates that are accepting bribes from corporate America. And so the answer to that is the default assumption. Yes, they are going to be accepting candidates who are taking a lot of that money that is the same exact corrupting influence on both the Democratic and the Republican parties. So again, you're cutting through to the core problem of the American political system, which is that we have two parties, not just two parties that are inherently bad because there's only two of them, but two parties who are bad because they're taking those bribes from corporate America. So again, if you're not willing to come out and make that affirmative stance against that in a principled way, then you're not changing anything about the actual main problem with our political system. So it's just a completely weaselly answer there to say, well, it's, going to be transparent and we technically have to file so people will be able to fact check that. It's like, just come out against it or say that you're going to be, in favor of candidates who are accepting those same exact fucking bribes.
And finally, I guess, it would be good to be able to get a clear answer from you on Donald Trump. What is more important to you, to see a Forward Party candidate become president of the United States, or to make sure that Donald Trump stays out of the White House? Let me put the question this way. If you were a Forward Party candidate, let's say in 2024, and you are running the risk of drawing voters away from the Democratic Party candidate in a way that would put Trump back in the White House, would you pull back to avoid that situation from happening?
Well, Jim, the truth is that you could resolve this particular issue very, very straightforwardly by adopting something called ranked choice voting, which would enable people to vote for anyone they want. And then if their number one choice doesn't win, then their second choice would get their vote. But the truth is that neither Democrats nor Republicans really want to solve for what you're calling the spoiler effect, because they're more about limiting the choices of the American people rather than opening it up. Our goal is a system that allows Americans to vote for whomever they want and not be, frankly, scared of, quote unquote, wasting their vote or spoiling it for someone else.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and end it there because, I guess we'll end it off on a positive note because he did actually mention a single specific policy that he's in favor of, ranked choice voting, which, again, 100% in support of that one. But, again, the underlying point here is that you could pretty much summarize the entirety of the Forward Party with their slogan, right? Not left, not right, forward. That's completely and utterly vapid and meaningless, okay? Because if you actually wanted to move the country forward, what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to adopt very popular, widely appealing left-wing policies, things like Medicare for all, things like a Green New Deal, things like legalizing marijuana, free community college, having Medicare negotiate drug prices. You could come up with so many different policies that are actually going to be moving the country forward in an objectively better direction, which again are all policies that are supported by this common sense majority of the American people. So if you actually wanted to be moving the country forward, you would be going in a left-wing direction. So if your whole party is about not left, not right, forward, then again, basically you're just summarizing that all your political party is going to be is a different label for, politicians like Mitt Romney to Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema to lump themselves in with that political party or that political label without actually changing the underlying corrupting influence within our political system, which is the main fucking problem. So, at the end of the day, I, in theory, 100% support third parties, and, if they manage to somehow make this work and, are aggressively pushing for things like ranked choice voting. That's good, all power to you, but, don't expect this to be a party that is actually going to really get to the root of the problem with our political system. They're basically just going to be Joe Manchin, Kirsten Sinema, Mitt Romney embodied in a political party, and they're not going to do anything to actually address the corruption or to even aggressively lobby for some of the most popular left-wing policies in the country.